Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another Wellness Webinar Sunday. I'm Amy Liebman, President of NTM Info, and I will be your host and moderator today. Thank you on behalf of all of us at NTMIR for joining us. Today, we're delighted to welcome back Dr. Devon Smith, who will present on managing stress levels while living with NTM and other lung diseases. Dr. Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist with more than a decade of experience researching and treating mental health concerns and psychosocial factors unique to chronic illness. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology at Oklahoma State University before completing a clinical psychology PhD program at Washington State University with an emphasis in health psychology. During her training and throughout her career, she has provided health psychology interventions in a variety of settings, including oncology, primary care, internal medicine, cardiology, pulmonology, and infectious disease. She received specialty training in sleep treatment while working at the Georgia Cancer Center for 2 years. In 2018, she was recruited for a faculty position at Augusta University Medical College of Georgia, which involved creating a behavioral sleep medicine clinic. Currently, she's an assistant professor at National Jewish Health in Denver, Colorado, and she works within the sleep medicine clinic and NTM fields. So today, during the webinar, you can ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can click on that little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the box, and then click send. At the end of the presentation, the moderator will read questions from the queue for Dr. Smith to answer. Today's webinar broadcast is being recorded and will be posted online at a later date. So if you missed the answer to a question that's asked, you'll have the opportunity to hear it again later. And a little preview of our upcoming. September is a very busy month for us with 2 webinars in our wellness series and 2 webinars in our Science from Your Sofa series. Dr. Michelle McDonald from National Jewish will present on how safe is sugar on Sunday, September 12th, and Dr. Smith will join us again to present on changing thought patterns to decrease emotional distress on Sunday, September 26th. In between those 2 webinars, we're going to have a webinar on patient-reported outcomes, which are becoming increasingly important in clinical trials for NTM lung disease. That webinar will take place on Monday, September 20th at 1 p.m., and it features PRO expert Dr. Ashley Slagle. And on Friday, September 24th at 12:30 p.m., we'll welcome Dr. Gwen Hewitt from National Jewish Health, who will kick off a 2-part webinar series on GERD when she presents medical management of GERD. You can learn more about NTM Info and research and sign up for our electronic news at ntminfo.org. And you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And now I'm going to turn this event over to Dr. Smith. Devon, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us again today.
Of course, thank you for having me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. All right, so can you see my PowerPoint slides here? You can? Okay, perfect. So today, as Amy mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about managing stress. And so specifically, I want to talk about how to buckle up for the turbulence in life, because life is going to throw us turbulence. It's pretty much guaranteed. And if you're living with a chronic health condition, you already know this. So the best we can do is learn how to manage our stress. And so let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So first of all, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how stress works. You know, this may be a concept that you're familiar with just from living your day-to-day life, but it can be helpful to understand some of the physiology of stress as well, so that when we talk about coping strategies, it makes a little bit more sense. The other thing that we're going to talk about is ways to buckle up for different types of stress. So specifically, there's some immediate stress responses that can include some different coping strategies. There's also ongoing stress. So these are stressors that we can't necessarily change and things in our lives that don't necessarily go away. So how do we deal with that ongoing stress? And then the last part is just making sure that we match our coping strategies to the specific situation. Unfortunately, we can do a lot of spinning of our wheels trying to solve different problems when the problem can't actually be solved. So we want to make sure that we're matching our coping skills to the specific type of situation that we're dealing with. All right, so first let's talk about some definitions. So you may be very familiar with the feeling of stress, but in the definition format, it's basically physical arousal or an emotional state that results when we perceive that the demands of a situation are greater than our perceived ability to cope. And so this can be physical, mental, emotional pressure that results in us feeling overwhelmed. So we have so much on our plates that we feel like we can't deal with it. That's when stress comes in. It can be a normal part of everyday pressures, but it can become unhealthy when it's unrelenting or when it starts to interfere with our day to day. So these things can be, stress can be brief, it can be situational, it can even be beneficial, and I'll talk a bit about that. But of course, over an extended period of time, it can become chronic and more debilitating. So stress is the state, whereas stressors are very different. These are the actual events that are perceived as harmful, threatening, or challenging. And so we'll talk in the next slide a bit about stressors and sort of from the evolutionary standpoint, but these are things that are happening that are causing stress. So it can be a chronic health condition. It could be something like a work deadline. There's different types of stressors. Where the difference comes in is these stressors may or may not be actually harmful or threatening. Sometimes the stressor can involve our interpretation of an event, which is quite different. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So when we talk about an immediate stress response, it's helpful to consider it in the state of fight or flight. So you may have heard of this before, but fight or flight is an actual immediate reaction when presented with danger. And basically, this comes from what we call our Stone Age brain. So this is how our brains were developed to deal with threats or danger. So back in the Stone Age, it was hard to live your day-to-day life without encountering some sort of daily threat or danger. And so our bodies developed this system to deal with these different threats, be it, a dangerous animal, cold, hunger. Our bodies learned how to react to those situations in the most beneficial way to keep us alive. So fight or flight is literally either we're fighting the threat or danger or we're running away from it. Over time, social psychologists and researchers have added this third category, or freezing or hiding or playing dead. Sometimes when we're faced with danger or a threat, we have a very protective reaction of actually freezing. So you may have experienced that before when you felt total panic and you feel just glued to the spot, can't react, can't do anything. It's actually a evolutionary response. So basically in this fight or flight response, this is all programming we have from thousands and thousands of years ago that helped us deal with threats. It can be helpful. It can serve us to actually, fight or flight, can serve us to get away or to deal with this threat, but it can also hinder us when it's we're perceiving a threat that isn't actually there. It's our own thoughts and worries that are triggering this fight or flight. So when we have a fight or flight reaction, we have physiological changes that happen without our even awareness that it's happening. It's automatic. And so our vision changes, our pupils dilate so that we can see our surroundings better. Our heart rate increases, our breathing increases, chemicals are released that into our bloodstream that help us prepare for action. Blood flow is redirected, so it goes to our bigger muscles so that we're able to run or fight more effectively. Our immune system is suppressed, and so different things that are happening in our body during this fight or flight stage. So in the short term, stress can actually be helpful. So when we talk about short-term stress, we're talking about a state when the stressor has an obvious endpoint, or it's the acute period where you're adjusting to the onset of a stressor. So in this period, if a threat subsides or a stressor is removed, your body would return to its normal functioning and state. So we have this initial fight or flight stage where our body is activated, but then it's pretty quickly followed up with this mobilizing stage, which we know is short-term stress. So over the next 48 hours, 2 days or so, our body is dealing with this stress. So it's helping us to mobilize our physical and mental resources to be able to respond. So what research has showed is we actually do need a little bit of this to be able to be productive. So you can see on this curve here, if we don't have enough stress in this short-term stress period, we're too laid back, we're inactive. So if we don't have enough stress, we're not going to have very much performance. However, if we have an optimal level of stress, so this stress level over here increases, our performance is actually ideal. So, for me, I work very well with deadlines. They're motivating for me. It creates just enough stress for me to be able to get stuff done. If I don't have a deadline in terms of my work, I tend to fall in this category here. I'm under motivated. I don't get enough done. So that deadline to me is very much motivating and keeps me kind of in this ideal range. However, stress can absolutely become too much. So when we pass this point of fatigue, we can enter exhaustion where we have too much stress, we're overloaded. It can be hard to balance all the things that we're supposed to be doing. And then we can even get into this anxiety, panic, anger, breakdown, burnout phase where our performance just drops off entirely. And so really it's a balancing act to be able to stay in this ideal range. So I'm sure you can think of some specific examples where stress was helpful to you in the short term. It motivated you to act, it kept you kind of in a problem solving state. But I'm sure you can also think of some times when stress was too much and it was debilitating. Oftentimes, stress becomes too much as it becomes chronic. So long-term stress, where it's repeated on a regular basis or doesn't improve with time, can have some really negative consequences. So let's say that a perceived threat doesn't subside within a few days. Our body starts to cope by releasing hormones like cortisol to sustain our preparedness. So we're still in this stress response, but now it's playing the long-term game. It's trying to keep us prepared for more than just that 24 to 48 hours. But that doesn't come without any consequences. It wears on you. So cortisol levels being released over time can wear on you both physically and emotionally. So in this long-term state, you may be experiencing multiple stressors. Let's say that you're dealing with your health and you're also dealing with family conflict, you're dealing with financial issues, you're dealing with just day-to-day stressors. These are all things that are going to pile up to create this chronic stress state. And it can look a lot of different ways, and it can look differently for different people. So a lot of times it can be experienced as difficulty concentrating. So it's hard to stay focused. It's hard to remember things. We're just overworked. Mentally, we're taxed. It can look like changes to appetite. So sometimes people in chronic stress states overeat or undereat. You can have trouble sleeping. Our emotions can be out of whack. We can resort to some behaviors that might not be the most helpful, but they actually, in the short term, make us feel better. Like having a big glass of wine is going to decrease your stress, but it's probably not going to get rid of it in the long term. You might start to feel unwell. And then a big thing here is shallow breathing. So chronic stress actually changes how we breathe, which is really important when we start to think about NTM. And I'll talk more about that in a few slides. So long-term effects of chronic stress, um, it can really impact a number of different physical functions. One, lung complications. So importantly to the topic we're talking about, you can experience increased exacerbations of asthma, bronchitis, difficulty with shallow breathing. So absolutely can impact your breathing. Shift in insulin regulation, that's important when if you're diabetic or if you have diabetes. Worsening pain or flare-ups. So when we're under stress for a chronic period of time, our body lives in a tense state. When you're tense, pain is worse. So that's one of the tricky things. We teach this to kids, when they're getting a shot and they're afraid of the pain, they tend to tense up. And then it hurts even worse because your muscles are very tense. And so you actually have to try to release your muscles and it's going to hurt less. Well, with any chronic pain condition, if you're stressed, your pain levels are going to increase. Suspension of tissue repair and inflammation, so it can take longer to heal from injuries. Weakened immune system. You may have noticed when you're really stressed out, you tend to get sick more often, and that's a direct link to the immune functioning. Increased mood and anxiety symptoms, so more depression, more anxiety, changes in cardiovascular health, memory changes, decreased sex drive. So all sorts of actual physical changes that can end up making you feel worse. And really this is through two different pathways. So one is indirect. Stress can undermine health indirectly. So you might resort to behaviors that jeopardize your physical well-being, like drinking that big glass of wine or bottle of wine or whatever. That can undermine your health, but it can also be these direct changes in body functionings like headaches, upset stomach, worsening of existing health conditions. So there's a direct and an indirect link. So switching gears to talk about what actually increases our stress levels. Researchers a number of years ago developed what's called a social readjustment rating scale, which measures the impact of major life events. And so they had people fill out, they had hundreds of people fill out this scale to see where different life events fell in this adjustment range. So events in life that cause major adjustment in an individual's daily life ranged on this scale from 0 to 100, with 100 being major, upset to daily routine and requiring readjustment. And so it's also associated with stress. And so what you can see up at the top here is death of a spouse was rated as one of the highest, most stressful events. But you can also see that personal injury or illness is pretty close to the top here. So it's absolutely a life event that can cause some major stress for most people. So you probably are already aware of this, but stress with health conditions adds to your stress levels because your life doesn't necessarily stop because you develop a health condition. So you're dealing with adjusting to new lifestyle, fears about your future health. A lot of patients that I work with NTM, they're balancing their family's worries about their health, which can be pretty taxing. And then, of course, just natural emotional reactions like depression, anxiety, anger, frustration. And that's on top of everything else that you have going on in your life. So health conditions absolutely can add a lot of stress to your life, but there are ways to manage it. But before we get into the management, let's try to put a number on your current level of stress. I'm a researcher, so I like numbers. And so hopefully this is helpful to you as well. But let's see how stressed you are currently. So what I want you all to do is take out a piece of paper, take out your phone. If you have a great memory, you can even try to remember these numbers to the different 4 questions I'm going to show you. I couldn't do that, so I suggest writing it down. But I'll have you write this out and we'll see how stressed you are. So the questions on this scale, there's 4 of them. And they ask you about your feelings and thoughts during the past month. So when you're answering these questions, just think about the past month. So from mid to end of July to now. So in the last month, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life? 0 would be never, 1 would be almost never, 2 is sometimes, 3 is fairly often, 4 is very often. So put down a number for number 1. Okay. So for number 2, in the last month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems? Now this switches where 4 is never, 3 is almost never, 2 is sometimes, 1 is fairly often, and 0 is very often for how often you felt confident about your ability to handle personal problems. Okay. So for number 3, in the last month, how often have you felt that things were going your way? Where 4 is never, and all the way up here, 0 is very often. So put a number down for that. And then the last one here, in the last month, how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them? Now we've switched back to 0 is never, 1 is almost never, 2 is sometimes, 3 is fairly often, and 4 is very often. So in the last month, how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them? Okay, so now add up all those numbers from the 4 questions to get your total. Okay, so scores can range from 0 to 16, with higher scores indicating higher levels of stress. So this puts a literal number on how stressed you might be feeling right now with everything that you have going on in your life. 6 or higher has been suggested as indicating high levels of stress. And so if you scored a 6 or higher, you might have a high level of stress in your life right now. There's been a couple of different groups that have been found to have higher levels of stress. Women are typically found to report higher levels of stress than men. Older adults report fewer stressors than younger adults, typically, according to research. And it varies by factors such as health, socioeconomic status, geographic location, ethnicity. So there's a number of different things that can impact your stress levels. So comparing it to other people, so in 1988, the US average on this scale for men was 4.2 and women 4.7. And you can see an updated version here that was done in England. The averages were actually closer to that high stress level. They were 5.56 for men, 6.38 for women. So just a way to look at your stress level and to ask yourself, is your stress cup overflowing? Is your stress level currently pretty high? If you're in this webinar, the answer is probably yes. And so you might be noticing some different symptoms associated with high levels of stress. And so I talked about some of these already, but there can be cognitive symptoms. A lot of times my patients ask me about memory. So it's very common for people to experience memory problems when they're suffering from high levels of stress. That's one of the reasons why I always recommend that you either record, bring someone with you, write down things during doctor's visits, because they can be high stress. And so during those times, it's going to be hard for you to encode that information and remember it later. You might experience, just constant worrying, poor judgment, seeing only the negative. This is very, very common when you're high stress, when you're under a lot of stress. Something very small may seem really negative or really overwhelming. Whereas if you're under low stress, that same thing could be, not seen as a negative. It could be seen as a neutral, or it might not even seem that big of a deal. Also, physical symptoms, we've talked about that, emotional symptoms, and then also behavioral symptoms. So sleeping too much or too little, isolating yourself, nervous habits like nail picking or biting, pacing. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about what we can do. So stressors may be unavoidable, but stress can be modified. So some of you may have heard of Viktor Frankl. He was an Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor. And he has a quote here that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So if you find yourself in a situation that you can't change, what you can change is yourself and your reaction to that situation. He actually wrote a really wonderful book that I recommend to a lot of patients called Man's Search for Meaning, that talks a lot about how do you deal with just abnormal situations that cause a lot of stress. So it's a great book if you haven't read it. So let's talk about equipping yourself for dealing with stress, both immediately and ongoing. So again, with our immediate stress responses, fight or flight, we can have all of these different physical reactions that's controlled by a specific part of our nervous system that activates this fight or flight response. Heart beating faster, breathing becomes quicker and more shallow, which is important again to people with lung conditions like NTM. If you're experiencing fight or flight, your breathing is going to change. And if you have a pre-existing condition that affects your breathing, that's going to make it even harder and more difficult. So one of the first ways that we can deal with this is to develop awareness. So thinking about how you specifically experience fight or flight. It's going to help you to identify the stress reaction more quickly and implement strategies to de-escalate this response. So everyone experiences fight or flight a little bit differently. You know, how I experience it in my body might be different than how you experience it in yours. You know, for me, fight or flight very much feels like panic. You know, I can feel my heart rate increasing. I can feel my breathing changing. I get kind of like a buzzing sensation in my head. So these different sensations, you first have to be aware of them to be able to change them. Sometimes it's really obvious when the fight or flight is activated. So I compare it to a fire. If you see a fire, your fight or flight is going to be triggered, and it's very obvious. You know, if you enter a situation that causes pure panic, you're going to be very aware that the fight or flight reaction is occurring. But other times it can be more insidious. You might not notice it until the stress response builds, like a slow carbon dioxide leak. You know, you might not realize that this fight or flight is increasing and being activated until you've developed that full-blown panic. So if you can catch it early on, you can stop it. So body awareness can help to identify the stress in our body earlier on, because our bodies tend to register stress before our conscious mind ever becomes aware of it. Our bodies are very sensitive to this in ways that our conscious mind doesn't necessarily interpret until later. And again, that's evolutionarily supported because it allows us not to think about reacting, but just to react. So one of the coping tools that I recommend is called body scans. And so if you do this regularly, you can start to detect small changes in your body that you may not have been aware of before. So I think about this like a metal detector slowly passing over your body. So when you do this exercise, you know, go somewhere quiet, lay down, you can sit up, but somewhere where you're feeling that relatively relaxed. And your goal is just to be aware of the physical sensations in your body. The goal isn't to change it. It's not to try to relax your body. It's really just to notice and become more aware of what's going on in your body. So you basically begin by starting in either, you know, the highest part of your body or the lowest, your feet or your head, work your way down or up, and then back up or down. So in this example, begin by paying attention to sensations in your feet, noticing anything like warmth, coolness, pressure, pain, any breeze, the feeling of socks on your feet, anything that you can bring your attention to. Then slowly moving up your body, moving through different body regions. spending time on each body part to just notice sensations. And then after you travel up your body, begin to move back down through each body part until you reach your feet again, remembering to move slowly and paying attention. Some people can do this great on their own, just kind of laying down and bringing their awareness to these different body parts and noticing what's going on. Some people, it's a little bit more of a challenge. And if it's a challenge for you, what I recommend is to do it with a guided audio. So if you Google body scan or body scan meditation, all sorts of free guided audio will come up. Some on YouTube, some on other websites, but you can listen to prompts to actually go through this body scan. But if you practice this with some regularity, you can start to notice these physical sensations without having to do this type of exercise, which can be helpful to be aware of what's going on in your body so you can then adjust. Another coping tool I recommend is called progressive muscle relaxation. So this is a little bit different than the body scan because you're not just noticing what's going on in your body, you're actually practicing making changes. So you practice tensing and releasing various parts of muscle groups to train yourself to recognize tension in your body so you can know when to relax your muscles. So we carry a lot of tension in our body, some people more than others, but most of us carry tension in our body without ever realizing it, which then can trigger this fight or flight. So if we're carrying around this baseline tension, it only takes a little bit of extra stress to really throw us into that full fight or flight response. So if we can decrease our baseline tension levels, it can help us de-escalate the situation. So you do this with different muscle groups, but a good example is with your hand. So what you would do is tighten your fist as much as you can, holding it for a few seconds and noticing what that feels like, and then slowly releasing the tension and noticing that sensation. And so when I do that and I make a fist and hold it really tight, I can feel some discomfort in my palm. I can feel some warmth. I can definitely feel the tension. And then when I release the tension, it almost feels tingly. I feel a cooling sensation in the center of my palm. It feels like my muscle groups are unbunching. So those are the different types of sensations that you want to start noticing with this relaxation exercise. This is one that I would recommend almost everyone that practices it does it with an audio guide, because it's kind of hard to remember all of your different muscle groups to be able to practice it. Again, if you Google progressive muscle relaxation audio, you'll get all sorts of free resources to be able to listen to that and practice it. And so the goal is that eventually, if you practice this enough, you no longer have to tense your muscles to be able to relax. You can notice that tension when it's occurring and relax automatically, de-escalating that fight or flight response. Another coping strategy here is to track ahead to cope. So again, in the line of awareness, figuring out what symptoms you most commonly experience when you're stressed, including what tends to happen when you notice that fight or flight is triggered. So for you, what tends to happen when you get really stressed out? Do you get headaches, backaches, muscle spasms? Do you notice that you tend to isolate or overeat, undereat? So do you notice that your GI system gets messed up? You're constipated or you have diarrhea. Do you notice that you start to feel really frazzled mentally? Do you notice that your breathing changes? So first, kind of knowing what your symptoms are and then tracking it. So the second step is to start tracking it. It doesn't have to be in this formal worksheet. It can even just be writing it down in your phone in a note on your phone, or keeping a journal and listing out these common symptoms and checking off the days that it tends to happen on your calendar, whatever. But to start to increase your awareness of how often are these things actually happening, so that you can then take it a step further and notice what are your vulnerabilities and what are your triggers for these types of reactions. So we call this a chain analysis or a behavioral analysis, but essentially it's just a systematic way to look at when you tend to get stressed. So when you notice that immediate stress response, when you notice some of those symptoms, your breathing changing, where are you, what's happening, what are the consequences, and then working your way backwards. What happened right before, what was going on that was stressing you out, thinking about, vulnerabilities and triggers in some, had you had enough sleep? Did you eat enough that day? Did you eat a bunch of crap that day? Had you been drinking too much? What was making you susceptible to that stress response? And so once we kind of understand the chain of events, we can start to break the chain. So we can start to say, oh, I know I didn't eat well enough today. I'm going to be sensitive to stress. I need to pay attention and really utilize my coping skills today. So you can start to plan ahead. So switching gears a little bit, there's still related to the fight or flight. There's something called the parasympathetic nervous system. So I talked a lot about the sympathetic nervous system. I didn't necessarily call it that, but the fight or flight basically is activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is just a chain reaction of, increasing these symptoms like pupils dilating, heart beating faster. But there is an off switch, and it's called the parasympathetic nervous system. So this parasympathetic nervous system helps calm us down and relax us after the sympathetic nervous system has been activated. So you can kind of think of it as balancing, the two offset each other, balance each other out, because you can't live in this activated sympathetic nervous system indefinitely. It's not sustainable long term. So our nervous system includes this automatic off switch that we can actually activate with breathing. So let me talk a little bit about breathing because it's so important, particularly for people that are living with chronic lung conditions. So when we breathe, we take in oxygen. We all know that, right? When our body uses oxygen, it creates carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that we breathe out. So when breathing normally, like this little graph up here, or this little image, the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our bodies are relatively balanced. So you can see oxygen is coming in, we're using it, so we're creating that carbon dioxide and we're breathing it out. So in our blood levels, our oxygen and carbon dioxide are relatively balanced and at this kind of moderate level. Now, when we exert ourselves, so when we're doing something that's physically demanding, with chronic health conditions or NTM, it might take very little to exert yourself. So let's say you're climbing a flight of stairs. What can happen is your breathing rate increases to take in more oxygen, but you actually need it because your muscles need it to fuel it. So when we're using that extra oxygen, it's creating more carbon dioxide. So our blood levels are still balanced. So because you're exerting yourself, you're taking in more oxygen, but you're using it, so you're releasing more carbon dioxide. Now, what can happen, I call this panic breathing, but really it's just breathing related to stress or anxiety. But what can happen with that is when we're anxious, we tend to take in more oxygen, but it's not because our body needs it. It's not because our body is working any harder. So it's not using up that extra oxygen, and so it's not producing extra carbon dioxide. So because carbon dioxide is being expelled faster than it's being produced, the concentration in our blood levels go down. So you can see here in this instance, we're taking in more oxygen, but we're not necessarily needing it or using it, but we're still breathing out. So our carbon dioxide levels decrease in our blood system. And so this unbalanced level of oxygen and decreased carbon dioxide can lead us to feel lightheaded, tingly in our fingers, kind of clammy, sweaty, a lot of symptoms that are associated with anxiety. So, this type of breathing can be problematic in terms of how we feel. Often it's related to chest breathing. So, just in general, as we age, we tend to breathe more through our chest, um, which is shallow and more irregular. And so, some of you that have come to National Jewish for evaluations, you've probably worked with some of our providers that have taught you different ways of breathing. So, this might not be entirely new to you. But what I want to highlight is it does also relate to our stress levels. So, when you're living with NTM, you know the importance of breathing. So, you're very aware of how important breathing is and what it can feel like when you can't breathe properly. But what you can do is you can actually improve your breathing through what we call diaphragmatic belly breathing. So, this is a more steady, deeper way of breathing, allowing for this normal exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, let's say that in this kind of vicious cycle of poor breathing, you start to feel anxious or stressed. So, a lot of times when I work with patients with NTM, they tell me, the masks that they have to wear for COVID actually feels like it's restricting their oxygen intake. So it's very common for people with NTM and pulmonary conditions to feel like anything covering their face or tight on their neck is restricting their air intake. And that's because you're really acutely aware of your oxygen and your breathing. And so that can create some anxiety. And so all of a sudden, then your fight or flight is triggered. So you're having this acute anxiety response because you feel like you're not getting enough oxygen. And you actually start to breathe more shallow. So you can start to breathe through your chest more shallow, more rapidly. So you're over breathing and it's causing this lack of CO2 or hyperventilation. And then you start to actually feel some of those physical symptoms of the lack of CO2, like tingling hands, clammy, increased heart rate, which can cause more anxiety. And you can kind of see how this just cycles through. So belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing cuts this cycle. So if you're able to breathe through your diaphragm, you're able to deactivate this fight or flight, activate the parasympathetic nervous system, actually get more balanced breathing, deeper breaths, and kind of stop all of these physical symptoms of the stress response. So if you've ever practiced this, it's a completely different way of breathing. So what I always recommend is lay down. So you can do this sitting up, but it's just much easier to see when you're laying down. And put a hand on your chest and put a hand on your diaphragm. If you don't know where your diaphragm is, it's kind of right in between your rib cage and your belly button. That's a good place to put your hand. And you want to practice moving the two hands. And so that's why I say laying down can be helpful because you can see your two hands. You can't see my hand down here, but you can see them moving. And so when you take a deep breath through your belly, so it goes through your lungs and it's a deeper breath, you can move your hand on your diaphragm up. And so that's taking a much deeper breath that's going to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. Again, this takes training. It's not an automatic way to breathe. You can see too in this little image over here, you can actually place something above your diaphragm, so on your belly, and practice moving that up and down. So just some different ways to practice. You can also use guided audio for this. I don't think, it depends on your style, but I don't think it's as important for this because really it's something that just is a skill you have to practice and learn how to do. The timing of your breathing and making sure you're breathing in slow enough and breathing out slow enough, that's helpful for audio. The diaphragmatic breathing part, though, I think just takes practice and repetition. And some of these cues. So seeing your hands move or seeing if you have a rubber ducky or something like that at home, seeing that move up or down. Okay, so switching gears to talk about managing ongoing stress. This is very different than acute stress. So we can't survive in that fight or flight indefinitely. In fact, that initial fight or flight tends to decrease pretty quickly, but it can lead to this chronic stress response. So if you're in, some examples here, like a bad relationship, a stressful job, they spelled stressful wrong. This is not my graph. Um, Toxic home environment, high crime area, poor sleep habits, ongoing health problems. So these different things that are repeated, that continue on, don't have an automatic end date, can lead to more chronic stress. So how do we deal with that? Well, as I mentioned in the very beginning, one of the first steps is to match the coping to the situation. So the first step is to determine which aspects of the situation are within your control and which aspects are out of your control so that you can apply the most effective type of coping skill. So a lot of time we spend our efforts trying to change something that can't be changed or that we don't have control over, which can actually just lead to creating more stress. Other times we dwell on the problem and all of the different aspects of the problem. We just kind of focus and I don't know if this is a psychological term or if this is a common term, but we ruminate. So just kind of dwelling and going over and over the different aspects of the problem without really thinking of it in a constructive way. What can we do to either fix this or feel better about it? And so doing that, just dwelling on those aspects of the problem can also create more stress. So if we can think of a situation that we're in and think about, okay, within this situation, what can I control and what can I not control? Because oftentimes, take a situation like a chronic health condition, there are aspects of that that are within your control, but there are also aspects outside of your control. And you want to apply the correct coping skill based on if it's something you can control or not. So starting with things that you can control, let's talk a little bit about problem solving. And so problem solving just on its own seems very simple. We all know how to solve problems in our lives to some extent, but if you do it in a systematic way, it's actually a lot more complex. And if you do it in a systematic way, it can also be more effective. So I'm going to break it down for you into 7 different steps that can be really useful. And I say that because I've actually used this skill before, and doing it in this manner is pretty effective. You might have to, kind of write it out the first time you do it, but over time, as you're aware of these steps, you can kind of carry them out in your head without actually having to be so analytical about it. So the first step when you have a problem that you can change, so something that's directly within your control, is to figure out and describe the problem. So you want to gather the facts, and I say here, describe just the facts of the situation. You really want to unglue your interpretations and opinions from the facts. So, let's use an example of, you're in a conflict with your significant other, and you think you initially define the problem as my spouse doesn't care about me. Well, when you look at that and unglue it and break it down a little bit, maybe what's making you feel like your spouse doesn't care is that he or she isn't listening to you, isn't doing what you're asking, or kind of reacting in the way that you would hope. And so really the problem then is communication. You're making interpretations and assumptions that your significant other doesn't care about you based on actions, but those actions are the actual problem. So that's what I mean by gathering just the facts and understanding the problem in its full. So describing the problematic situation, including consequences. So for this example of someone who's in a job that they don't like, the consequences of working in a job that they hate is that they're unhappy. And this unhappiness is building and it's leaking into other aspects of their life, making them feel unhappy with their life. So that's what I mean by the consequences is, what is this leading to? breaking it down into smaller, more manageable pieces to fully understand each aspect of the concern. So it's very different to say my job is awful, I hate my job, versus I don't like that I feel isolated at work. So try to understand what specifically about the problem is causing you distress. In the example with the spouse, what exactly is making you feel that your spouse doesn't care about you? And then thinking about potential obstacles. So describing obstacles or conflicts making it hard for you to solve the problem. So if you could easily solve the problem, you wouldn't be sitting here trying to figure it out like this. So there's something about the problem that's making it challenging for you to solve. And so be aware of that. So for the job example, I don't have another job to go to and I can't afford not to have a job. So that's an obstacle that makes it hard for them to solve the issue. The second step here is to check the facts. So I kind of talked about it in the first step here, but often we respond to our interpretations of the situation rather than the situation themselves. So our interpretations can be correct. I'm not saying that they're always incorrect, but they can also be incorrect. So we just have to check and make sure. So ask yourself, are my facts correct? How distressing is the situation? Do the conflicts or other obstacles I've described reflect the facts of the situation? So sometimes we catastrophize a situation and make it a much bigger problem than it really is, especially if we're under a lot of stress. So we might look at something and say, all these obstacles and conflicts that I'm assuming are going to happen, we're saying with 100% certainty that they will happen when it's not 100% certain. So really taking a step back and making sure it's accurately reflecting the facts of the situation. Also knowing that when you're in a period of emotional distress, it's easy to see more obstacles than there really are. So, if you're under a lot of stress, all these obstacles may seem like they're just insurmountable. So keeping that in mind, that it could look very different under a different emotional state. So the third step here is to identify your goal in solving the problem. So keep it simple and something achievable. Often the major task for this step is to reduce painful emotions. So identify what must happen or change for you to feel okay. So finding a way to work and like my job, or at least not hate it in that job example. That's the goal, is to at least not hate your job. Okay, and so that's something that's maybe achievable. Maybe you can't find your dream job right now, or maybe you can't like your job, but can you find a way not to hate it? And then this fourth step here, you want to brainstorm lots of solutions. And I put lots in caps here because you want to come up with as many possible ideas for solving the problem. You can ask people you trust for suggestions. You really don't want to be critical in this stage. You want to have a long, long list of options of solutions. So it can be one or more actions that lead to the goal. So the goal is not to, in that job example, is not to hate the job. So what are some different options? And not judging your ideas at this stage. So brainstorming really requires freedom. So you have to let your thoughts run free and wild. You don't want to get critical. You don't want to say, no, that's a stupid idea, I'm not going to write that down. You really just want to write down everything that comes to your mind, to generate a balance of effective and ineffective ideas. So, if you're running into an issue, let's say problem is your faucet is leaking. Okay. Options you could put down at this brainstorm stage. You could put down that you could burn down your house. That would solve the problem. You would no longer have a faucet leak because you would no longer have a house. So that's an example of something that you don't necessarily want to not write that down. You want to write down just anything that pops into your head. Another example, you could go to bed and just ignore the problem. That's absolutely something you could do. You could move. I mean, you want to think of just as many ridiculous options as you can, and then later you'll kind of weed out the ones that are actually realistic and the ones that are not. So that's in the next stage here, is you choose a solution that fits the goal and is likely to work. So a solution might work, but it's useless if it's impossible to put into action. So make a priority list by organizing the top contenders. For that leaky faucet example, burning down my house probably would not be a top contender for how I want to solve that situation. But you want to base it on the likelihood the solution would work and the feasibility of implementing it. So how likely is it that you can do this, and how likely is it to work? So once you have that list, you can choose the top 2 best solutions and think about pros and cons for those solutions. And then you can put the solution into action. Try it out. Break it down into steps, and know that it's not going to always be a one-stop easy fix. You might encounter some different problems in this action phase. There's problems with inertia. This is too hard. I'm too tired. I don't have time. I don't want to deal with this. Fear generating thoughts. If this doesn't work, I'll look like an idiot. I might upset people. Willfulness. I shouldn't have to solve this. I shouldn't have to resolve this conflict in my marriage because it's not my fault. And then impulsiveness, just running head on into the problem without even thinking about if this is an effective solution. So these are some things that can get in your way. So we're trying to be more systematic about it so that we're not falling into these traps. And then the last step here is to evaluate the results of implementing the solution. So this is a really important part of problem solving that we often don't do. So you want to ask yourself, are you satisfied with the results? Do you feel better about the situation than you did before? Are there any negative outcomes for yourself or other people? Effective problem solving often takes multiple efforts and different solutions before you finally find this set of solution that works. So you might have to go back to step 5, go back to your list and try another solution. Problem solving is a process that takes time and patience. And I think people don't realize that it does take repeated efforts. Okay, and the last thing I'll say about this is oftentimes the first effort doesn't completely solve the problem. So it usually at least improves it somewhat, but then you have to go back to your list and maybe implement some additional solutions, or start another problem solving list where you now try to solve the residual distressing elements that are left. Okay, so what do you do though if you can't control a situation? So, with problem solving, you have to be able to control the situation. You have to be able to have some sort of ability to change it. But if you can't change a situation, what can you do? You can decrease your distress when the situation is outside of your control. So even if you can't control it, you can control your emotional response to it. You can learn how to regulate or improve your responses if you can't change the situation. And you can also change how you feel. And if you can't, then you can work to completely and willingly accept the reality to gain a sense of freedom and reduce suffering. So if you are in a situation and you are never going to feel better about it and you're never going to be able to change it, you have to accept it. And that is a hard thing to do. And I'll talk about that more in a few slides. So first though, how can you change your emotional response? So you have a situation, you can't change it, you feel really crappy about it. How can you feel better emotionally? One coping tool is called ABC. And so this works to increase positive emotions, build mastery, and cope ahead of time with emotional situations. And I'll break this down a little bit more clearly. So within that ABC, the first one, accumulating Accumulating positive, so positive activities. When we're feeling bad, we tend to not do much that brings us joy or brings us enjoyment, and that can make us feel even worse. So in this coping tool, the goal is to do something that can hopefully make you feel better, even if it doesn't make you feel better immediately. So practice by doing a small positive activity every day while making a point to acknowledge the good parts of that activity. So adding 1 or 2 positive activities, it says here, won't change your life, but over time, the happiness they create starts to add up. So a lot of times when we're stressed, like I said, we do less that we enjoy, and then we're pretty miserable pretty fast. So to change our emotional response, try to build in what I tell my patients is 15 minutes every day to do something positive, to do something that you could enjoy or you have the potential to enjoy, even if you don't enjoy it right now. This can be as simple as sitting outside in the morning if you live someplace that's cool enough to do that. It can be taking an evening walk. It can be taking a bath, taking a hot shower, buying a new candle. It can be small. You don't have to have these giant activities every day to bring joy to your life, but you want to be intentional with it so that you're aware you're doing something for yourself to build up these positive emotions. The other thing here is building mastery. So plan to do at least one thing every day to build a sense of accomplishment. So when you're trying to change your emotional response, you're having a really bad day, you're really stressed, you don't want to go try to do an activity that's going to just absolutely frustrate you and leave you feeling just completely hopeless. So for me, if I'm having a really stressful day, I'm not going to go try. Right now in my kitchen, we're trying to rewire our light switches. I'm not going to go work on that during a stressful day. That is not going to help me build any sense of mastery. But something that I could do that could help me feel accomplished, I have some craft projects, maybe working on one of those. That can help me feel like I'm building some sort of accomplishment. So plan for success, not failure. Don't go into it thinking this is just worthless. It's not worth my time. You want to try to choose something that's difficult, like building mastery isn't, necessarily going to be washing your hands. That's something that's pretty easy that everyone can do. But you don't want it to be so difficult that it's impossible. So that's why I say something like a craft project or something that you tend to be good at that leaves you feeling accomplished. And you can increase the difficulty over time. So if the first task is too difficult, do something a little easier next time. If I wasn't aware that that light switch project would just be completely frustrating, and I went ahead and tried that to build my mastery on a day where I need to change my emotional response, I would quickly become aware that it's too difficult and I need to recalibrate and rethink about what I want to do to build this sense of mastery. And then look for a challenge. If the task is too easy, try something a little harder next time. So you want to leave the situation feeling better than you did before. And so generating a list for yourself of how you can build this sense of mastery, because just like positive activities, doing something that builds a sense of accomplishment over time will change your emotional reaction, even if you can't change a situation. Another coping tool, opposite action. So this changes your emotional response too. So when we experience an emotion, a behavior usually comes with it. Like if you're angry, you might fight or argue more. If you're sad, you might withdraw. And your body causes you to react to these emotions in specific ways. However, doing opposite actions helps you to change your emotion. If you typically start to yell when you're angry, try talking quietly and politely. If you withdraw when you're sad, make a point to visit a friend next time you feel this way. So if you're feeling stressed or anxious and you know that your go-to action for feeling stressed is to, scream at your children or significant other, then you want to try to do the exact opposite. You want to try to, have a quiet, polite interaction with your family. If you're feeling sad and your go-to when you're feeling sad is to sleep, you want to try to do the opposite of that. Maybe go for a walk. So these are things that are very different from how you would normally respond, but it will change your emotions. Another favorite of mine is called the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. So if anyone that I've worked with in the past is in this webinar, you've probably heard me talk about this, but it's a really great grounding exercise that can help you practice mindfulness. So mindfulness is basically the practice of being non-judgmental in the present moment. So a lot of times when we're stressed, when we're anxious, we're thinking about the past, things that have happened before that have gone wrong that we're worried are going to happen again, or we're worried about the future. We're, assuming that our health is going to get worse. We're, planning for this awful future where we're going to be completely debilitated. We're thinking of worst case scenarios or even realistic ones, worrying about the future, but we're not really in the present moment. So grounding or anchoring yourself back into the present moment can help decrease your stress, change your emotional response, because in the present moment, very rarely, unless we're in immediate danger, do we have things to feel stressed about. So the way to practice this is to try to point out 5 things that you can see, and you want to be detailed with it. So you all can see my background here. So 5 things that you can see here. Maybe you notice the quality of the light, that it's kind of a warmer color. Maybe you notice the white drapes or whatever. Maybe you notice the accordion style blinds. You want to try to be specific with it, noticing texture, light, color, really becoming aware of what you see. Then you want to challenge yourself to point out 4 things that you can feel. And so these are things that you may not have been aware of in the previous moment. So can you feel, the shirt on your shoulders? Can you feel the cushion if you're sitting of the chair? Can you feel if you're wearing jewelry? Can you feel that on your body? So challenging yourself to actually feel, different aspects of your body. 3 things you can hear. Again, be detailed with this. If you hear a sound, is it loud? Is it quiet? What's the quality of that sound? 2 things you can smell, and then 1 thing you can taste. And so that all that's doing is bringing your conscious awareness back into the present moment, and it can help de-escalate that stress response and calm you down, bring you back to the present. Okay, and then the last coping tool I'll talk about before we get to questions is radical acceptance. And so I mentioned that briefly when talking about the emotion-focused coping skills of when we can't feel better about a situation and we can't change it, all that's left is accepting it. And it's called radical because it's not just, accepting one part of the situation. It's accepting the whole situation and everything that's involved with it completely. And like I said, this is a hard skill to master. It takes repeated practice and attempts. So what is radical acceptance? So with COVID-19, perfect example. Non-acceptance, why is this happening? I don't want this to be happening. This is making life more challenging. I don't like this. People are stressing me out. I'm stressed out. I'm shut inside my house. I want it to end. I hate the mask. COVID sucks. These are all non-acceptance standpoints, because at the end of the day, full radical acceptance would be, it is what it is. Same thing with chronic illness. Thinking about hating being sick. I wish I was normal. I'm always in pain. I don't want to be in pain. Why is this like this? This isn't fair. Those aren't acceptance statements. Acceptance of a chronic illness. This is how things are. I may not agree with it or like it, but being resentful and refusing to accept my reality will not make me better. So you may have had some gut reactions to those statements, because a lot of times with radical acceptance comes, automatic, what we call willfulness, or, oh, it can't be like that. You can't think that. You can't say that. But what you want to realize is radical acceptance does not mean it's not a weakness to accept something. It doesn't mean you're giving up. So saying that COVID-19 is what it is isn't saying you're not going to try to do everything you can to protect yourself and to protect others. You're just acknowledging that the situation is what it is. It means that you recognize and understand the current situation. And it actually allows you to be free from denial and allows you to move forward. Although it can feel like if you accept something, you're just giving up. You're throwing your hands up and saying, oh, it is what it is. I can't do anything. I'm not going to do anything. But that's actually the opposite. It's very freeing to be able to accept something and then be able to move forward. So when you're talking about it as a coping tool, radical acceptance is fully accepting something without judging it or trying to force it to change. So you're not saying, I hate COVID-19, but it's here and I guess that, whatever. You're judging it. It's not acceptance. You're not trying to force it or change it. You're just accepting it as it is. So think about, what are you refusing to accept? For a lot of people, it can be memories, particularly if you have any history of trauma or something really difficult in your life that you've been through. It can be hard to accept that that's happened to you. Beliefs that often get in the way is that, like I said, it means you're giving up or that you're okay with the situation. So let's say that someone was sexually abused as a child. That can be a hard fact to radically accept. But by radically accepting something, you're not saying that it was okay. It's not forgiveness. It's not saying that the situation was okay. It is just accepting that it happened. And emotions that often get in the way, intense anger at someone or something, guilt or shame, and rage at the injustice of the situation. It's not fair to have a chronic health condition, and that can get in the way of you accepting that you have a chronic health condition. So I love this example here. You've never tried to change the color of the sky. You never judged it for being blue. It's just blue. That's how it is. If you hated the color blue, you would still accept that the sky is blue. So keeping in mind that radical acceptance is something you choose to do, and it doesn't mean you like or agree with it. It's just you're accepting it. So another example that I give people is, it's like if I ordered a shoe. I ordered shoes on the internet and I ordered a size 8, but I got a size 6. Okay, I wear a size 8 shoe. They sent me a size 6. I could not accept that. I could be frustrated with it. I could complain about it till I'm blue in the face. I could try to shove my foot into the size 6. I could, throw it in the corner of my room and forget about it. I could do all sorts of things, but that's not going to change the fact that I got the wrong shoe size and I can't use these shoes. But once I accept, okay, I have in my possession a size 6 shoe. Once I accept that, it actually frees up all of my responses to be able to go back to the company and say, hey, you sent me the wrong size, send me the right size. But until I actually accept that I have a shoe that I can't use at this moment, I really can't make any forward progress. So radical acceptance actually does help you move forward. So how do you practice this? Well, it's not, you're not going to wake up one day and you've fully radically accepted everything difficult in your life that you can't change or feel better about. It's going to require continued practice. So what you need to do is accept that reality is what it is, figure out what you can control and what you can't, looking at it from a non-judgmental perspective. So you're not throwing judgment. You're not, condemning something or condoning something. You're just looking at the facts. You're not fighting reality. You're not saying, you're not willfully ignoring it or pretending it doesn't exist. You're facing it front on. And you're learning how to live in the present moment despite the pain that it might cause. So it takes a lot of coping statements and a lot of practice to be able to think this way. So when one of the best practices is when you notice statements coming in that are denial or not acceptance of reality, is just to remind yourself, no, this is what it is. This is the situation. This is how the situation, I can't change what has already happened. Everything that has happened in the past has led up to now. This is how it has to be. You know, this is my body and this is what my body is doing. This is how it is. There's no point fighting the past. I can survive the present, even if I don't like what's happening. I don't have control of the past. The present is exactly what it should be given what's happened before. So it is what it is, and it's exactly how it should be given everything that's led up to that moment. And so again, it takes practice and just a constant, you know, coping statement and reminder of the reality of the situation. All right. And so in leaving, you don't have to have this figured all out. So you don't have to see the whole staircase. You just have to take the first step. So you don't have to leave this webinar knowing that, you know, you can solve, you know, you have no more stress in your life. You can deal with it all. You can apply these coping strategies and everything will be great. But hopefully what you do leave with is knowing how to take the first step, you know, taking one of these skills and putting them into place and practicing it. Okay, so any questions?
Thank you very much, Devon. Yes, we do have some questions in the queue. So let me start right off. One patient asks, I began doing transcendental meditation a month ago. It's a serious commitment involving 2 sessions a day, 15 to 20 minutes per session. I hope it will help me with anxiety and breathing. What are your thoughts about transcendental meditation?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the relaxation exercises are built from meditative practices. And so there's been some research to show some great benefits of, you know, some more intense types of meditation. What I will say is it's definitely a skill and it's not for everyone. So I think it's fantastic that you're trying it out. I encourage that. I mean, that's amazing that you're trying something that takes so much effort and dedication, but also don't feel bad if you end up feeling that it's not for you. Sometimes super intense meditation can actually create more anxiety for people because they feel like they're not doing it correctly and they start judging themselves. And so, you know, I guess my recommendation is to try it, but be okay if it doesn't work out. There's still other things you can do.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good point. Somebody is asking, are there therapists to help people with NTM specifically to help manage stress? So I guess another question I would have to follow on to that is, like, is there a specific you know, sort of branch of therapy that somebody should look for in a therapist if they're looking for a therapist?
Yeah. So let me show you all something since I have a few minutes here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to actually share a different screen here. Hopefully I can do this properly. Can you see this website here?
We can see Google.
Yeah,
okay,
perfect.
yes. Yeah.
Okay, so if you go to Psychology Today, that is my go-to recommendation for finding a therapist. A lot of times people start with their, you know, their insurance website or something, and that's fine, but it's just going to give you a list of names, which isn't super helpful. So if I typed in, I'm going to type in my old zip code in Augusta, that's where I used to live. And so if I type that in to find a therapist, what I can then do is I can filter it by my insurance. So let's say I want to do Medicare. Okay, so now this is going to show me all of the therapists in this area code, or I'm sorry, zip code that take Medicare. And so the next part that I'm going to get at here is you can look at types of therapy. You can also look at specific problems that you're experiencing, issues. So in here, one good thing to put you probably aren't going to find a therapist that specializes specifically in NTM, because that's a very specific field, but you're probably going to have plenty of options for therapists that deal with chronic illness. And so that's a great thing to search for, because a lot of us, there's a specialty of psychology called health psychology, and that's what my specialty area is. And it's helping people with chronic illness. And so people should have that focus on chronic illness should have a broad skill base to be able to help, whether it's NTM, MS, different types of chronic illness that can impact people. Another good one here is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. That's a really good one for chronic health. The other good one I'd recommend is acceptance and commitment therapy. This takes a different approach in that it doesn't work to change your thoughts and emotions, but to accept it and live despite those painful emotions. So that's kind of my recommendation for that. I mean, try to find a therapist that focuses on chronic illness and that maybe does either ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, or CBT.
Okay. Are there apps that you recommend for tracking stress or stress reduction, et cetera?
Yeah, there's a lot of apps out there. A good one is Calm. You may have heard of that. And all of these apps have like a free version and then a membership version. I always recommend just start with the free version, or the 7-day trial or something, to see if it's something you like. But there's Calm, there's one called Headspace, there's one called Breathe. Breathe is spelled a little bit differently. I think it's BREETH. Yeah, I think those are the three main ones that I recommend.
You had shown some tracking forms before, and somebody was asking if the tracking forms might be available to us. And I do think, yes, we can make those tracking forms available. We'll get those out to everybody.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint too with all the coping skills.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody is asking, why is our immune system suppressed in fight or flight situations?
So the reason, from my understanding of why immune system is suppressed, is because you're basically the focus is going to other areas and other functions. So, providing blood to big muscle groups, focusing on, the immediate threat versus the long-term threat or other threats. So it kind of stops all the other processes and really focuses on, the immediate danger.
Okay. Are devices such as the Apollo Neuro effective? I have not heard of the Apollo Neuro.
I think so. I've heard of some different devices that you can wear around your head. I don't know if that's one of them. I haven't seen any research like conclusively saying that this helps or this doesn't help. I think with devices, my biggest recommendation is always, it's probably worth trying if you want to, but I wouldn't recommend spending hundreds of dollars on a device, because if it was, some perfect solution, everyone would be purchasing it. So there's a lot of money-making devices out there, I feel like, that maybe don't have the research and science to back it up. So I would just, kind of look at what is the device claiming it does. Is that claim supported by science and evidence? And science and evidence would mean research in peer-reviewed journals, not just, because the company says it works. And then what are the underlying principles of it? And is it something that you can replicate without spending hundreds of dollars? So a lot of times, a device might say, it's helping you relax because it there's some devices that alert you when your heart rate increases, so then you can practice skills to, calm down and lower your heart rate. Well, you could do the same thing with a heart rate monitor, which costs a lot less. So really looking at what the underlying principles are and seeing if, it's supported, and if it's, if it can't be done in a different, cheaper way.
Okay. Um, Somebody's asking if you can talk a little more about the frustration that people are experiencing when they live with NTM, that specific part of it, I think.
Um, so just, I don't think I understand the question.
The question just says, can you talk just a little more about the frustration about living with NTM? So I guess maybe that frustration sometimes presents a bit of a block to dealing with with whatever they need to deal with.
Yeah. So I think for frustration or any sort of anger, or, you know, um, a lot of that I think comes out, it's not necessarily a situation that you can change right now. So problem solving would not be my go-to recommendation for that frustration. What I would recommend is doing something to change your emotions, to increase your positive emotions. So some of those emotion focused skills that I talked about. But really, I think the big one is radical acceptance. Um, that end skill that I talked about, how, a lot of the frustration comes from not accepting things. And a lot of times when I talk about radical acceptance, it's a triggering topic because it can create anger. Just to suggest the idea that you just have to accept it can be frustrating in and of itself. But it's actually really freeing to be able to accept a situation and not have it cause you the same level of emotional distress.
So the same person commented, when your lungs don't work when you feel they are supposed to. So I guess if the radical acceptance is my lungs don't work even though they're supposed to, I guess the next step after that is for them to decide how they would like to proceed after that acceptance, maybe. Like, what do they do next? Do they go to a pulmonary therapist and start to figure out what exercises help them with their lungs? Is
I
that
see.
one
Yeah,
step
yeah.
that they might take,
Okay.
or how would they proceed after that part where they have
Yeah.
to accept that their lungs don't work properly, I guess?
Yep. So a lot of times once you are able to accept something, it opens up the possibilities of what you can do about it. So once you're able to, kind of accept and understand, okay, my lungs don't work how they are supposed to. Another thing is, I'd want to unpack, what does it mean for you specifically of how your lungs are supposed to work? We a lot of times put judgments on ourselves of, our bodies should work certain ways when they just don't. Our bodies don't always work the way that we think they should work. So unpacking that a little bit, but then also once you accept it, you can look towards solutions. How can I increase my, capacity for physical exertion? I talked a little bit in the last webinar about activity pacing. So how can you increase your activity and work within your limits to actually increase your activity, even though you're having some of those difficulties with your lung functioning? So how you can work within the limitations, and then how you can also increase your decrease the limitations, so increase your functioning.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that was very helpful for them. Somebody else has commented, yoga is also a very good way of keeping fit gently, and it also teaches meditation and calming. Different levels and types of yoga can be found to fit a particular need.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yoga is fantastic for all those reasons. I think I have heard, and I know a little bit less about the any physical limitations to it, but I know that some patients who are doing certain types of yoga, some of our medical providers haven't recommended it because you don't, I guess with acid reflux, you want to be careful with some of the positions that you do. So just keeping that in mind, some of the positions, but there's always adaptive yoga. So even if you can't, do handstands and turn upside down or whatever, you can still do a lot of the adaptive yoga, which is great for breathing, which is great for movement and all those other reasons you mentioned. I totally agree.
Yeah, I will say Pilates is very similar in terms of movement and breathing, and both yoga and Pilates can be adapted for various physical limitations, including the need not to turn certain ways, including upside down.
Yeah.
Um, somebody has commented, part of the frustration is that what you can do one day you can't do another day. Since it is variable, then you have to radically accept that you can't do it that day, but not long term. Do you have any advice to deal with that variability?
So that's a great question. It actually kind of flips. I think the radical acceptance would be different. The radical acceptance would actually be the variability that you have to accept. Um, Not necessarily the limitations, but the actual fact that it does change over time. Um, and so the other thing I would say about that is, I think some of the skills that I mentioned, where, just keeping in mind that things look very differently on different days. So, for instance, with building mastery, one of the skills I talked about, it's not going to be helpful to try to do something really, kind of difficult and not within your skill set on a day you're highly stressed out. Same thing with, your physical functioning. You might have to adjust what you do based on, how your functioning is that day, and that's okay. And that's what's the radical acceptance should be focused towards, is the actual variability.
Okay, and we have one more question in the queue here. Can you recommend any books that will help us learn more coping skills? And let me just say, if you can't think of all of the book titles right offhand, that's something that you can get to us, and we will definitely be able to put that out to everybody. We'll get that information out to everyone.
Yes, I have so many book recommendations.
Then maybe we should just start a monthly book recommendation.
Yeah, just off the top of my head, I personally, and I think a lot of other people, have found a lot of valuable information in that Man's Search for Meaning book by Viktor Frankl. It's more philosophical. Again, it's dealing with the Holocaust, but he does really talk about different ways of thinking and adapting to really horrendous situations, and thriving despite what life throws your way. So I think that's a great book. If you're wanting something more practical with coping skills, there's a book called The Happiness Trap. It's written by one of the creators of that acceptance and commitment therapy I mentioned, ACT. So the idea is that we're not built to be happy all the time. That isn't our just baseline. And so the idea of choosing happiness and don't worry, be happy, all of that is actually pretty toxic. And so it gives some coping skills for how to live more realistically. And then the third one I'll mention, and I can also, dig through all my book recommendations and give you a list, Amy, but there's one called Full Catastrophe Living by John Kabat-Zinn, I believe is his name. And he's a physician that started doing a lot of work within oncology and helping people adapt and find meaning in life despite their situation and circumstances. And so I like that book a lot too.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think, have we come to the end of our questions? Let me see. Do we have any more we do not have any more questions in the queue. Thank you everybody so much for attending today. It has been an absolute pleasure. Devon, thank you very much. Again, it's been a wonderful webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Everyone, we look forward to seeing you again at our future webinars. Have a wonderful week, everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.